So I've washed my fabric, I've hung it to dry and I've pressed it. I've pressed it in half lengthways, so selvage to selvage. The selvages are these bits here on the woven fabric at the edge of the fabric where it's got kind of a band and then a little fraying bit there on the edge. So I'm going to put the selvages together, and I've got the right sides on the inside, so I folded the fabrics right sides together with selvages matching there. So I've got all my fabric folded in half. Now this pattern piece here, I'm going to do this first. This is the back view, and I'm just going to place that along the fold here. This says here, this arrow means that you place it on the fold. So I'll place that on the fold that I've pressed, pin it all the way round, and then I just cut round, and then when I open it up, I've got an entire back panel. And then I can use this bit of fabric here at the side to cut out my pockets and my tie. And then the remainder of my fabric I'm supporting by draping it over a chair, because I don't want it to be hanging off and weighing itself down off the end of the table. So I just put a chair there to support the remaining fabric. Once I've finished cutting this piece out, then I'll just draw the rest of the fabric up and I'll cut my front panel. So I don't need to worry about measuring for a grain line, because we're cutting on the fold, and the fold, because the fabric is folded selvage to selvage, we know that that fold is nice and on the grain. And I will cut out with pins and scissors. You could cut out with rotary cutter and pattern weights if you want. It's up to you, whatever you rather have. Make sure before you start pinning and cutting that your fabric is beautifully flat and there aren't any creases or folds on the underside that you don't want. And just make sure that this edge here is nicely on the fold. So I'm going to pin that now and cut it. Pinning everything on, and I just wanted to mention that these pieces here that aren't cut on the fold, they have a grain line on them. And what you want to do is measure from your selvage to the grain line here, and then from your selvage to the grain line here, and make sure that those two measurements are the same. And that will mean that this line sits parallel to your selvage, meaning that that pattern piece, that piece of fabric, will be on the straight grain. So this lovely big back view panel is now cut out. What I want to do is just very carefully transfer any markings on there. So on the back one we've just got notches, so I'm just going to snip a tiny little snip, about 1/2 centimetre deep, into each place where I see a notch. On this one, just make sure that you cut the notch with the correct corresponding size on it. And then there's another little notch that I'm going to cut there. Once I've done that, then I'll draw the fabric up and I'll get cutting out on my front panel. I've now placed my front panel piece so that this edge here is against the fold of my fabric. And I should just pin that in place, making sure that there's no wrinkles on the underside of my fabric, everything's lying nice and flat. Whoops, and I should just go ahead and cut that out. The front panel is cut out and I've snipped into these notches. I just wanted to talk about this point here. It's very important that we mark on above and below the slit here. And you've try to make sure my fabric has a slip there. So go to the number 6 for my size 6. I'm going to put a pin in through the middle of that black dot and both layers of fabric, and the same again there. Obviously you're just going to put your pin through your corresponding size. Then just peel back the paper pattern till you get to the point where the pin has gone into the fabric, and I just make a little chalk mark on both sides at that point, which will really help when it comes to constructing our caftan. We need to make sure that all of those marks have been clearly transferred. So I'm now going to move on to cutting out the neckline facings, and I just had a bit of spare fabric left over from the side of where I cut out that front panel, and it's just wide enough. If I fold that in half, got a nice lovely straight selvage there. It's just wide enough for me to fit my facings on. If you're making a slightly larger size, you may not be able to be so frugal. You might have to cut that sort of alongside the caftan pieces as described in the instructions, but I'm just being a bit frugal, so if I've got a lovely piece of fabric left over, I might be able to just squeeze something out of it, like a little dress for a little kiddie or some scrunchies or something. So I try to, if and where possible, kind of squeeze things out of as small a piece of fabric as I can. So these are both cut on the fold, so those double arrows just mean to cut on the fold. And once we've cut this out of the fabric, we're also going to use these same pattern pieces to cut out some interfacing to stabilise. Very important to stabilise those neckline areas as much as possible. Put that pin over there. It's so hot. Can't concentrate. It's about 26 degrees and stood by a huge window. Right, but this is exactly what we want for caftan weather, isn't it? I'm not going to complain at all. There we go. So I'm just going to cut that out now, and they will make my neckline facing pieces. And then I'll get my interfacing and I will cut out my same front and back neckline facing pieces in the interfacing, the fusible medium to lightweight, depending on what fabric you're using. And I've got a nice easy fuse, super soft vice line interfacing that I use that comes with these kits, which is just perfect. Oops. I'm on a race against the clock now to get this all cut out before school pickup in 7 minutes. So nearly there. Right, so we've cut out our fabric and we're now ready to cut out our facing. So I've got some interfacing here, which is a nice soft lightweight. It's got the gluey side there. I've folded that in half, got my fold running along here. So I'm just going to place my caftan facing pieces on the fold here and pin and cut around them. Sorry if you can hear lots of noises in the background. We've got the doors wide open. It's an absolutely gorgeous day today. Just puts a spring in your step. Beautiful. But someone's cutting down a tree. Something like that. So just pin these in place and then chop round them, and that'll be our neckline facings done. Now you've got one other piece that requires facing, which is this one. Piece number G, which is the bodice panel that sits at the centre front. I've got an idea about how I want to do this. You'll notice I didn't cut this out of fabric yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to block fuse a piece of the fabric and then cut this out, fabric and facing all at one go. I think I'm going to get a truer square shape if I do it like that, so I'm going to give that a try. Just because you want that square to be really nice and sharp and clean. If you cut the square from the fabric and then you cut the square from the interfacing and you fuse the two together, it's hard to maintain that beautifully right-angled square shape sometimes. So I'm just going to give that a try as an alternative. We'll see whether it works. Okay, so simply going to cut those out now. Hello, I hope you can hear me okay. There is a little bit of noise going on outside. So I'm now on to applying the facing. So I've got my ironing mat here. And with the front panel there, the bodice panel, what I'm going to do is I've got a piece of scrap leftover fabric from cutting out my caftan. That's the right side there. I'm going to turn that over so that the right side is facing down and I'm looking at the wrong side of the fabric. I can see there's a very definite fold there, which that was where the fabric was folded in half, so I know that's the straight grain line. So I've got a nice straight grain line to use as a guide as well. And then I'm going to just place my interfacing with a gluey side facing down somewhere on that fabric, and then I'm just wanted to make sure that that is big enough to fit that panel. And then what I'll do is I'll cut it out once I've fused it. So I've got my iron on a medium setting. So that's now fused in place, and in a minute I'm going to come along and I'm just going to cut out, and it's going to be a nice true square there. It says cut 2, so I'm going to have to cut 2 fabric and cut 1 interfacing, so I'll cut 1 with interfacing and 1 without, and I'll do that in a sec. So the next thing to do is to do your neckline facing. So if you find your neckline fabric and your interfacing for your neckline facing, I'm going to lay those out. So let's do the back one first of all. I'm going to lay that out face down, so I'm looking at the wrong side, and then I'm going to get my interfacing and carefully place that on top, lining up the raw edges like so. Now the fabric might have moved a little, depending especially on the type of fabric that you're using. The interfacing won't have moved around too much because interfacing is very stable. There, so that's lined up nicely. If you want, you can grab your pattern piece and just check that that's the correct shape and that things haven't sort of wobbled out of place at all. Take a bit of time doing that to make sure that it's right, and then carefully by lifting, don't sort of rub the iron around because you'll make everything move about. So just lift and place and hold. Wee little bit of steam there. And that will just fuse your interfacing to your fabric to make your back neck facing, and then we'll repeat that same process for the front neck. My iron is a little bit sticky because quite late last night I was ironing planets onto a t-shirt for a space day at the school and I wasn't being particularly careful. My iron needs a bit of a clean now. I've got one very excited 5-year-old dressed up in a planet t-shirt. I'm just thinking about this just for 1 second. This line is going this way, sort of indicating that you would cut, you know, if this was the straight grain, the fold line here where you cut your dress, and then this is the grain line here, you want those to match up. If you've got a pattern on your fabric with a direction on it that really matters, that isn't going in all different directions, like you would want to line that line up this way. So here's my fold with my scrap of fabric that I'm using. So yes, if your dress is, you know, if you think your dress was cut, there's the fold line there, and your dress was cut that way, and you want your print to run in exactly the same direction, then just when you're choosing your fabric to cut this out from, make sure that you're cutting it that way. If you're doing a stripe, for example, then you might think actually it's quite nice to cut it the other way and create a feature, so your stripes will be vertical on your dress but horizontal on here, or same with, you know, a different type of pattern. So just have a think about when you're choosing your fabric to cut this from, that, you know, if there is a direction to the print, just pay attention to that. Now with my fabric it doesn't matter, so I just need to make sure that it is on that grain 2 centimetres, that edge of there is 2 centimetres away, and if I use a right angle and I line up this line here on my ruler with that fold, that grain line is at right angles. So I'm just going to use this to cut all of these out in one go. And you know, you could just cut this pattern piece out as part of your main cutting, but the reason why I'm doing it this way is so that I could interface it first and cut it out like this on a cutting mat, because then I get a really nice precise square. There we go. And all this preparation will help me when it comes to the later stage of cutting out my when it comes to the stage of sewing together this front panel. Now you've got these 4 dots. I'm doing a size 6, so I'm looking at these ones here, and they are set at 1.5 centimetres in and 1.5 centimetres in from the edge, because this piece has a seam allowance of 1.5 centimetres. And these dots will just help you line up your hello Pussycat, will help you line up your panel with your dress. What I'm actually going to do to help myself for later is I'm actually going to draw on a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance all the way around my dress. So I've got, in fact it's 5/8 of an inch, which is 16 millimetres, but we're going to call it 1.5 centimetres because it's harder to sort of say 16 millimetres, isn't it? But there we go. So I'm going to just draw a line 1.5 centimetres in there. You can use a sharp chalk pen, or you can use a heat erase friction pen type thing, and then I'm going to draw 1.5 in here. Making sure it's nice and square. And I think this is just going to help me with that stage. And then those dots are basically the corners, so you've got your corners here and here and here and here. It's 1.5 in and 1.5 in, and that's going to give me a nice precise stitching line to follow. And I shall just also draw that on my my non-faced piece. Be gentle with it because you don't want it to pull the fabric around too much. But all of this will help in the long run. And I'm drawing on the wrong side, obviously. I don't want this to show. It should wash off, but there we go. So we've got our dots there, which are our corners that are 1.5 in. So that's that piece all nicely prepped. And the trickiest part of this project is to attach this. So anything you can do to make that easier is really going to be worthwhile. Everything's now cut out and prepped, so let's have a look at what we've got. My 2 bodice panels at the front there, one interfaced and one not. I've got the front of my caftan and the back of my caftan, those great huge big pattern pieces. We're going to have fun managing those. 2 pairs of pockets, so 4 pocket pieces in total. My front neck facing, which is interfaced, my back neck facing, which is interfaced, and 2 ties. I've got my instruction manual here ready to follow along. My thread, and I'm going to use a Sharps or Microtex style needle for this. This is a fairly lightweight viscose crepe, and I just know that viscose sometimes can ladder a bit and be a bit temperamental, so by using a Microtex or Sharps needle, that's just a finer needle that's really sharp and great for sewing with this fabric. So what I'm going to do is set up my overlocker, set up my sewing machine, and have my ironing board at the ready. I'll lay out all my fabric pieces next to where I'm working, have a cup of coffee, always important, and then we shall get on with the wonderful task of sewing our Charlie Caftan. Very exciting.